with war now upon the land, and civil war at that, where you have different sections of the country trying to, the South is trying to fight for its independence, and the North is trying to keep that from happening and keeping the country together. What did Texas do in the Civil War? That's always the question that comes back around. Well, almost immediately, 3 regiments of infantry head to Virginia because everybody rightly assumes that the real pointy end of the spear is going to be right there outside of the Confederate capital. These regiments, the 1st, 4th, and 5th Infantries, become the nucleus of what will become Hood's Texas Brigade and will be famous in the story of the Civil War. Similarly, the 8th Texas Cavalry heads off to Tennessee to defend that national border. These guys, under Benjamin Franklin Terry, go into history as Terry's Texas Rangers. Once again, trafficking upon that idea that Texans are just natural soldiers. The 2nd Texas Cavalry remarkably heads out into the territories, into New Mexico territory. Not only does it pick up ownership of all the frontier forts, but it goes out there to make a play to create a Confederate territory, the Confederate territory of Arizona. 3rd Texas Cavalry goes up and keeps an eye on the Missouri and Indian Territory frontier by joining the Confederate Army gathering in Arkansas. There's also quite a few other smaller company and battalion size organizations that leave Texas that really fold in with other state regiments. So you have some, for instance, Texans serving in Kentucky and Tennessee regiments that head that direction. And why would they be willing to do that? Because they're serving alongside their cousins. Again, most Texans by 1860 weren't born here. By the end of the year, 1861, there's 25,000 Texans serving in the Confederate Army. And they have fought in places like Wilson's Creek in Missouri and also out around Mesilla and Las Cruces in New Mexico. Well, there's also individual Texas personalities that come into play with the Confederacy. Albert Sidney Johnston, who at one time was the Texas Secretary of War during the Republic period, by this time is an American Army officer serving in California. He resigns his position with the United States Army and makes his way from California all the way to Richmond, where he is very highly regarded by the new president of the Confederate States of America, Jefferson Davis. And in fact, he gives Albert Sidney Johnston command of everything west of the Appalachian Mountains. Big chore for a guy. Ben McCullough, the old Texas Ranger, famous all the way from the field of San Jacinto to the fields of Buena Vista. He is now a Confederate brigadier general and commands an army in Arkansas. There's other famous Texans that will rise up through the ranks or serve at the regimental level. Too many to mention in this brief time. But within the Confederate government, people like Louis T. Wigfall and John H. Reagan both assumed very important roles within the life of the Confederacy. Well, not only are Texans contributing troops and political minds and military leadership, but Texans are also contributing beef cattle. And Texas cattle drives begin to step up as beef is driven into Louisiana, swum across the Mississippi River, and then distributed to feed various Confederate armies across the entire nation. Well, Texans are involved in the opening campaigns of the war. Again, we mentioned Hood's Texas Brigade. These guys will end up fighting in most of the battles of the Army of Northern Virginia. So this is Texas's contribution to the army led by Robert E. Lee, and they end up becoming fairly famous as a result. In the same vein, Terry's Texas Rangers, even though Benjamin Franklin Terry is killed in its first encounter, keeps his name and becomes one of the more famous mounted units in the Confederate military. The 4th, 5th, and 7th Texas Cavalries head out to New Mexico to reinforce the 2nd Texas Mounted Rifles. Out there in the New Mexico territory, they launch a campaign. They take Albuquerque and Santa Fe under the leadership of Henry Hopkins Sibley. Ultimately, that campaign fails, and that brigade, shattered, retreats back to San Antonio. There's also Texas troops that pour into Arkansas. They fight a major battle at Pea Ridge. In that battle, Ben McCullough is killed. The Confederate Army is nearly routed. Well, they were routed. And that army is then moved east of the Mississippi to reinforce an army being formed near Corinth, known as the Army of Mississippi. Now, that's essentially what goes on in the early part of 1862, but there's another event that occurs in 1862. New Orleans falls, and the Battle of Shiloh occur, both in early April. At the same time, the Confederate government passes conscription. Conscription means that if you're between the ages of 17 and 45, you must serve in the Confederate Army unless you have one of the various listed exemptions, and there's very few, and they're tough to prove. Well, what does that mean? That means now 92,000 men in Texas are eligible and required to serve in the Confederate Army. And remember, there was only about 25,000 that had joined the Confederate Army voluntarily prior to this date. So that means that there's about 65,000 Texans, men between the ages of 17 and 45, that now have to volunteer for the Confederate Army or be conscripted. So the vast majority of Texans that serve in the Confederate Army are not what I would call enthusiastic, rush to the color type troops. Well, what does Texas do in the war then with all these troops going in? Well, the majority of Texans enlist in cavalry regiments. There's an old saying that Texans won't walk a mile if they can help it. You know, they'll get in a car to drive around the block for groceries, even today. And so they don't like walking if they can help it, and so they flock to the cavalry regiments. Even so, Texas does raise 22 infantry regiments, as opposed to 44 cavalry regiments. But of those 44 cavalry regiments, probably 2/3 of them are dismounted and essentially used as infantry. A regiment being about 1,000 men on paper, about 500 men in reality. You kind of get an idea of where the Texas troops are being distributed. In addition, Texas has more than 24 artillery batteries, both coast artillery, heavy guns on the coast, and field batteries. Texans are present in nearly every battle of the Civil War in one shape or the other. It may be just a handful, it may be just a Texas leader, but Texas is represented. Even so, the vast majority of Texas troops serve in either Louisiana, Arkansas, or Texas. Well, does the war come to Texas? Absolutely. I mean, the first evidence that, in fact, there is a war on is that the United States Navy blockades the Texas coast. So if you're on the beach at Galveston, if you're at the mouth of the Brazos at Velasco, you can look out into the Gulf and see the silhouette of United States warships cruising along the horizon. U.S. troops do, in fact, land and take Galveston in late 1862, but they're only able to hold it for a couple of months. What's happening in the state other than that? Texas secessionists are suppressing any hint of Unionist activity anywhere in the state. And this is manifested in several bloody incidents and dramatic incidents, most notably in Gainesville, Texas, with the Great Hanging, and also the attack and subsequent massacre of Germans that were leaving the hill country, passing into Mexico, ostensibly to serve in the Union Army. Confederates intercept them and wipe them out on the upper Nueces. So the war is visited upon Texas. It's just not in a dramatic, massive campaign sort of way.